Hang on.
It's just our mere appearance.
Hey. Yeah, we're good.
So, I think we should probably make a start about now. The interested surpass the capacity of this room, but I think we'll take this number today.
Wait.
I better speak quickly. The polls are declining. So, first of all, I guess an apology from us in the sense that we were going to have a debate with myself and Thomas and two guys from the Debating Society. Unfortunately, both sides had one of their members drop out. We had the chair drop out, the Debating Society couldn't send a second member. So, therefore, I'm taking the position the chair. I am the treasurer for Warwick Marxists, so I'll try and remain as impartial, not biased as I can. Yes, I may need to with the current polling. But to give quite a generic introduction to this question, I think we should go back 30 years ago to a guy called Francis Fukuyama, who published his infamous book, The End of History. And so many of you will know what Francis Fukuyama was arguing. He was arguing, capitalism is here to stay. It's not a question of socialism or capitalism. Capitalism is here. Western bourgeois liberal democracy has triumphed, and we need to get serious about how we make capitalism work. And you see this play in practice as well. You could talk about new labour, neoliberal labour, removing clause for taking out the sort of ownership of the means of production, if you like, and in that way you see it manifest itself in practice. But then, quite ironically, Marxists would point out capitalism has resurrected that question in the 2008 financial crisis. And today, we've seen sort of a wave of new sort of writers, publishers, sort of reconjuring this question. And the common examples are the Bloomberg Press's article, "Give Marx a Chance to Save the World Economy," the Terry Eagleton book in 2011, "Why Marx Was Right." And actually, there's an interesting quote in that book, which is, capitalism is in crisis when people are talking about capitalism. And here we are today, talking about capitalism. So from that point, I think I'll go to the speakers. We're going to have Thomas, the president of Warwick Marxists, giving the side for socialism, and we're going to have Jonathan from the Debating Society giving the side for capitalism. So, take it away.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Oh, you already increased. Thank you very much for coming here today. I want to, there are many aspects of capitalism in which you could talk about, in which you could argue that systemic racism and sexism it produces, the environmental crisis it creates, the mass poverty, the continued inequalities, etc. Yeah, and we could speak very fondly on all of those points, etc. But one of the points I really want to focus on in my short introduction is the whole idea that actually, the greatest argument on the side of the capitalists, that despite, all your socialist talk of equality, of fairness, of democracy and all of this, that, we'll actually create a world in which, you can't produce economic growth, in which, we'll all be equally poor. Margaret Thatcher's famous quote, problem with socialism, you have money to deal with. Let's actually look at what's currently happening in the capitalist world today. The predictions from the IMF and the OECD read like horror stories. Twice already, growth has been forecast down since October 2016 by the IMF. They say we're in a period of slow and almost no growth at all. The OECD predicts 40 years of stagnation. The IMF is less optimistic and predicts 100. This is the type of eternal crises we have entered. We can see this all throughout society. In sections of, we see the capitalist retort, to try and create, to try and boost profits, to try and increase wealth, to try and get the economy growing. They tell us we need austerity. The Tory party stands there saying, Labour will not deliver us economic growth. We must, attack the working class, cut wages for doctors, attack train drivers, attack teachers, do all these horrific reforms. Put people on food banks, because with this austerity we will finally deliver the world in which we need. But what has it accomplished? What has 6 years of Tory rule actually produced? Instead, it has, Britain's living standards have fallen the third greatest amount in all of Europe, only behind Portugal and Greece. We see again that world trade, and not particularly Tories' fault, I'll give them that, but still, world trade has now slowed to historic levels. Before 2008 financial crisis, it was at 8% growth per year. It's now at 2%, below actual world GDP growth. This is the capitalists come up with more and more ingenious ways to kickstart the world economy. Negative interest rates, helicopter banking, all sorts of weird type things. ECB, they currently pump 80 billion, quantitative easing. The ECB currently pumps 80 billion euros into the European economy per month, and it still achieves nothing. These forecasts only get worse. And this is before you even take into fact the political crisis. They have constantly come from the mass oppression of the working class on a great scale. We are already seeing the huge rise of populists, such as Trump, Farage, Le Pen, all across the world, in the Philippines. Even the Chinese capitalists, who, by complete irony, call themselves the Communist Party, are now even struggling to maintain growth, and now going for more racist attacks on what we see as trying to boost the levels of the hand compared to other ethnicities in China, because they cannot escape this crisis. This is type of backwards, reactionary thinking which we're seeing. And this is, and this isn't a product of bad ideas. This is a product of a crisis of capitalism. This is a product of huge attacks by of the financial systems on the working class, of huge economic instability. Again, the European economies now look even worse for wear after a referendum for no in Italy. The huge levels of corporate debt in the Italian banks, currently at 250 billion euros, now look set to plummet, now look set to cause a European-wide financial crisis. And this will only lead to greater populism, greater demising, and greater friction within the globe as a whole. This all comes, and we'd argue this more in depth, but it all comes from this inability from capitalism to grow, to give the needs of the working class and society as a whole, and instead comes from its constant internal contradictions, the fact it continually hits crisis. Marx says in 1848 in the Communist Manifesto, the periodic crisis of capitalism which we now face are deeper than ever. Well, he could have been writing that in 2016 more than anything. So what do we propose? We can argue all day that capitalism is pretty bad, but increased by 2%. But what do we actually propose? What is the idea? We propose the ideas of socialism, of democratic ownership of the means of production by the working class, by ordinary people. They always retort, what about, is it really fair that we all get paid for the same amount of work? Well, in capitalism, the wages and wealth is distributed on this basis. If you work twice as hard as me, then, but I own the means of production, I get 99% of the wealth, or 90% of wealth, or whatever ridiculous statistics which change by the day, showing the huge levels of concentration in the world economy today are, and you get the rest. In socialism, we say, let the workers decide. Let's not have the tyranny of the bosses. Let's have the working people decide through democratic debates. And instead, if I work twice as hard as you, then why not have my wages twice as high? If your work is 3 times as hard, why not then be 3 times as much? We can decide through that. They constantly say about human nature, about the fact that socialism is never achieved in practice. Yet you can look back through history to find huge amounts and huge gains by ordinary people through implementing such democratic and economic reforms. If you look at the Paris Commune, where in 1868 they were able to separate church and state, create workers owning the means of production, saw huge rises in education levels, health levels, in all statistics really, until they were brutally murdered by bourgeois forces. If you look at, let's say, the achievements in 1917, before it descended into Stalinism, you see huge gains by women, ethnic minorities, LGBT people. Interestingly, Russia was one of the first nations, Lenin's Russia, USSR, was one of the first nations on earth to decriminalize homosexuality, to bring in to bring in the social reproduction, the housework that women would constantly spend doing, drudging hours of the day without any pay at all, to bring that into to socialise it, to bring it onto the streets, into public places, to massively reduce the levels of oppression we were facing. It would then, I would argue, that what we saw then was the defeat of these gains in the revolution by Stalinist forces, by the fact the revolution was isolated, and by the fact that Russia wasn't too advanced an economy. But these are just two of the many, many examples in which, having these abilities, having democratic control of the economy, having rational planning, having everyone having their say, and not just a tiny, rich minority, can lead to huge advances for the gains of everyone. It isn't for the poor and oppressed, in which socialism just benefits, but of course they are the main beneficiaries. This is for humanity as a whole. Trotsky talked about that in socialism we can move mountains, we can change the world to our fitting, we can unleash human potential, we can save all the Einsteins which rot away in Foxconn plants, working 18 hours a day in some cases for very little wages, and allow them to use their productive powers. Instead, all that money, all that wealth lies trapped in the hands of a few, and we are unable to access it for the detriment of all of society. We don't say that capitalism has never achieved good things, but it is an economic system which time has come. It is an economic system which no longer promotes human growth, which promotes the human spirit, and which promotes just general wealth in total. For this, we need a socialist economy, a socialist world, and we hope you agree. 36% of you do. Thank you very much.
Well, if 2016 has taught us anything, it's not to trust the polls. Good evening. I'm here to talk about capitalism, or as I like to think of it, the status quo. More or less why it's not so great, and also talk about why socialism as a political model, not as a thought experiment, but as an actual political program, is complete in its purest form, or in any form that rejects the tenets of capitalism, is essentially undoable. I will be covering, throughout my speech, I'll have three main themes that will come up over and over again, so keep an eye out for them. One, who has power? In terms of distributing resources, who distributes? Who decides how resources are distributed? Second, incentives. Why do we do things? Not the normative that socialists so enjoy. Why should people do things? How do they actually do things? What is their incentive to do something? And then who benefits, which I think we both can agree on. We want someone to benefit. We've got a negative case and a positive case. I'm going to skim through my negative case because it's negative and a bit sad. But essentially, what history provides us for any political ideology is empirical evidence to some degree. And we heard a bit of it just now. So we think it is useful to examine how socialism has come about in the past to give us at least some indication, given that we can't find it anywhere at the present, really. I mean, it's all gone. We need to look into the past and see what sort of themes. Well, I'm going to argue that history shows us that socialism is essentially coercive, and that fundamentally it creates a human cost at a level which we cannot morally support. And then I'm going to do a positive talk about why markets work. First, we heard about Lenin. Wonderful, wonderful Lenin, the visionary, the greatest socialist project of its time, transforming Russian society into a socialist utopia, or at least something approaching that. But what actually happened in the 4 or 5 years that Lenin actually ruled? Now, let's recognize that, of course, Lenin had a really tough job. His country was an entire mess. But when, in a regime which says it wants to protect the working class, you initiate a program to consolidate the political position of your party, which has seized power in a coup d'etat in November of 1917, not the popular uprising of February, but a coup d'etat, storming the Winter Palace with your guards and your special forces, and then consolidating a position after the unfortunate failed assassination attempt in 1918, through systematic mass terror that some estimates say killed 10,000 in 1918. Richard Pite says 140,000. I've seen estimates of up to 1.5 million. But frankly, featured such events as striking workers being arrested and extrajudicially shot, 200 of them in Moscow, 1,500 in Astrakhan in 1918. That featured the use of poison gas, chemical weapons against peasantry, which is supposed to be helping in the Tambov rebellion, creating an economic system of mass nationalization, state centering, centralizing of control, and grain requisition, which obviously the peasants weren't particularly happy about because you're taking all the grain and then supposedly you're redistributing it. They're really just taking all the grain. Leading to not only peasant rebellions, but your own special forces, the forces that Lenin himself described as the reddest of the red, rebelling against you because they feel like you no longer support the socialist cause, does not really point to anything to me that this is really much of a success, so to say. Rather, what we see, or I see, and capitalists see, through evil capitalists, etc., is that what has happened is, in their desire to implement a total socialist program, as Bukharin called war communism, essentially, he called war communism as something approximating normal economic policy, nationalization, collectivization, these sorts of terms that we like to think about with socialism, comes at a massive human cost. Say 140,000 killed in the Red Terror. War communism led to a famine which killed another 2 million. Because you're requisitioning grain, because grain production has halved in less than a decade. And of course, World War I is a mitigating factor. Yes, that does not help. But when you're continuing that, even towards the end of the Civil War, that does not imply to us that A, people particularly want socialism, or B, that this socialist agenda is being implemented with anything like much acquisition on behalf of the populace. And indeed, the way Lenin saved his economy is the New Economic Plan, which was a basic mixed economy. He allowed peasants to sell their agricultural surplus on the common market, which consequently resulted in a boost of agricultural production of 40% in a single year. He bothered to actually produce. So really, when Lenin stepped back and said, I'm not going to introduce my socialist policies, I'm going to take a step back, he saved his economy by taking up the basic tenets of capitalism. Small internal market, limited enterprise, private enterprise, trade was being introduced, MEB now. So if we look just across history of socialism and what socialism has presented to us so far, it is a history of brutal, brutal repression against the very groups of people that socialism purports to help. Because as soon as people say, why are you taking my property from me, which I have invested my time in, that is a threat to the very tenets of the ideology which socialists claim to support. And that leads to mass repression, and we cannot stand with that. My positive case, I've only got 2 minutes, bloody hell. my positive case. How do markets work? Essentially, in a market, if you want something, people will recognize you want something and seek to supply something. It is the most basic in sense of, it is the politics and economics of exchange. And so, people will go out of their way to try to supply something through a market to someone who desires something. So, think about a comparison between capitalism and socialism. In capitalism, the decisions of who gets what is entirely up to the people's needs. I need X, therefore I get something. I need Y, therefore I get something. Exchange. Whereas in socialism, we have a state monopoly where all property is the property of the state, and the state has to give it out. So what we really have is a reproduction of a feudal society, where all the poor people have to basically be petitioned, or well, they don't petition because the supposedly benevolent state gives out to them. But at the end of the day, the people who have the power is the state. And the state is removed from people, especially in big countries. So say someone's needs change. There's suddenly a very cold winter or a very cold spring. But there's no more sale of winter coats. In a market society, suppliers will see that it's particularly cold and continue supplying winter coats because they recognize they can make money out of this. That's good. A state, because of its layers of bureaucracy recognizing this, has much less time takes a lot longer to respond. So we have the distribution is much more efficient in markets. And also, we've got incentives. I'm going to make money. It's not surprising that when peasants were allowed to sell their surplus on the market, that productivity raised 40% in the 1920s. I mean, straightforward, right? I invest my time and I get what I can out of it. I am doing the work and I'm getting my just rewards. So when we hear about the crisis of capitalism currently, let's not forget socialism in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, 60s, 50s was also in crisis. That Nyerere's Tanzania lagged behind the capitalist Kenya in terms of economic growth by a solid 10% year on year. And that since 1990, 35% of people in the world were poor, impoverished. Today, 10%. That is so easy to complain. Just so easy to say the status quo is shit. But at the end of the day, it's not that bad. Especially not when you compare it to what has come before. Thank you.
Wow, just brilliant speeches from both speakers. At this point, we'd like to take it to the floor to have any questions aimed at either speaker. Yes.
Could I throw in a few, if that's all right? Or are you going to?
Can? Yeah.
Oh.
Are they directed at any particular person?
Well, I'll put three, I guess, towards just you. Well, I'm biased. Yeah, believe it or not, I'm not being paid by the Warwick Marxists. But I'd ask you if you're aware of the concept of the fallacy of empiricism. So you talk about empirical evidence, you're looking at solely Russia. For each statement you talk about Russia, I talk about Guatemala, I talk about Chile, I talk about Grenada, all countries that went socialist and in a more democratic way than Russia did, were hugely successful. And then, ironically, coincidentally, the capitalist bastion in the world, America, decided to lead undemocratic coups and putting dictators in order. So I'm curious as to why it is you feel like you only refer to Russia and pretend, therefore, Russia is a statement to the world. Would it be fair to base all views on democracy on, say, Egypt, Russia, Turkey, or China, which are all false democracies? Also, I'd say for your brutal repression comment, I'd just like to say, surely that's a fallacy because, well, more people died in South America and Central America than died in the entire Eastern Bloc or any communist country in the same period of the Cold War. More people died under Pinochet, South American dictators and Central American dictators than did under the entirety of the USSR and Eastern Bloc.
Is that...
Which is period for period. There's two. I'll leave it there.
I don't take some more questions and then we'll take some more questions and then we'll come back to the panel. Yes.
Yeah, so directing it. Well, socialists generally assume that equality is a necessary good thing, but people are different, you know. If people are better at their jobs, shouldn't they be allowed to get better? And if you feel like you're in poverty and you blame the government, aren't you just a victim? Like, you know, if you're in a shit situation, you have the freedom of capitalism to, you know, just make a living for yourself and become who you really are and become better, whereas in socialism you're coerced. And in more extreme cases like in communist Russia, you just get completely repressed and everything's really inefficient and the state's really shit. And it's the same with quite a few communist states. I mean, I went to Cuba and it was just so much more inefficient than just the UK. Would you say that's a good thing?
Probably one more question before we come back to the panel. Yes, who said with the Apple? Yes, so I have a wonky eye, so I'm looking at you.
So could you guys just define what exactly do you mean by socialism? Or maybe outline the major differences between what you are arguing for and what we've seen, or what we saw before 1989. Is it the same system you're arguing for, or do you also disagree with some things?
Great question. I'm going to come back to the start. Okay, we'll come back to the panel now. Usually that's the first question. I'll let you respond to that.
The easiest answer for why I just looked at Russia is two quick responses. One, I ran out of time. And two, it's a good example to take because it is so prominent in our collective history. However, you mentioned other ones. In my head, I've got Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh. Why is Ho Chi Minh as being slightly less repressive and socialist Vietnam? I mean, if you want, it's these things make grim reading. Vietnam, by 1975, 65,000 people extrajudiciously executed, almost all from political opponents. In the second 5-year plan of socialist Vietnam, these are all statistics from Jacqueline Barbaret, who's a French historian. 1.3 million people forcefully relocated, rustification, moved to the countryside against their will. And these are just, you can label them bourgeois if you want, but I think of them as people who have livelihoods, family, and mouths to feed, and common passions. And implementing policies which are this brutal against them, forcing them to move, give up their livelihoods, seizing their property, or even killing them, does not, to me, seem like a sort of system that I would want to stand behind. I've also got quotes from Cuba. Nasser was not particularly hard socialist anyways, but he also had some very authoritarian tendencies. And it goes on, Ujamaa policy in Tanzania was forced upon people. Your second point, I didn't really understand. We can weigh up debts between military dictatorships and socialist dictatorships all we want.
Which is the point that all of them were capitalist and those were socialist.
It's so easy to categorize, isn't it? This is what you look. In university, you learn to question these things. Capitalist, because they hung out with the US, but they probably oppressed, so they had institutional corruption, which is against the market system. So, on the other hand, we can give you the example of France, West Germany's post-Franco Spain, England, and none of them are amazing economies now, but they function, and they don't involve mass political oppression. Throw examples where you want. I was just giving some examples.
Okay, so now we'll go to the question of equality. Why do socialists preach it, and is socialism just a coercive state?
Well, if you don't mind, I'm actually going to start with our friend at the back's question on, what do we define as socialism? And as we define as socialism, we define it as democratic ownership of the means of production by the working class. And I think this is the key point, which many of these criticisms, and very rightly so, have been made. Let's say we can talk about the horrific regimes of Mao's China, Stalin's Russia. The list goes on and on and on. And I completely agree in your criticisms of me. Well, not completely, probably short, but I agree with many of your criticisms because they weren't democratic. To quote Trotsky, socialism needs democracy like a human being needs air, like a body needs oxygen. And this is the key concept here. But under capitalism, we live under the tyranny of the bosses. Let's give an example of, you talk about, how, let's say, people find them grain mass repossessed, how, people, let's say, suddenly can lose their houses, etc. Is that really any better for equality and freedom and all of these great concepts which liberal capitalists hold so dear when it's suddenly done by the market rather than the state, when suddenly you are made homeless, hungry, starving and dying by the state rather than the market, when the market does it somehow good? I think this is the key concept. And I would say that there is an awful lot to learn from Russia. But fundamentally, Russia went the way as it did. It went into the Stalinist bureaucracy because it was isolated. It was on its own. It could have gone differently. And that's actually why Lenin bought in the NEP. 1919, the world looked at Germany as Rosa Luxemburg, stride up with workers running their own factories, running their own places like that, and they were on the cusp of socialism, they were on the cusp of this great system, and they were shot down brutally by Freikorps. Her body was thrown into the rivers in Berlin. And after that, well, Russia failed. The choice wasn't between liberal, prosperous capitalism or socialism. It was between Stalinism, a system which I detest, and or fascism. Effectively, this is what we are left with. I think these are where I would say in which your point is from. Just to get on to some of the other things. Again, you speak of equality, and I completely agree. We're probably very different. I'm very different to Roland here. I know that. Me and Jack, nothing in common, barely anything. And let's say people put in different levels of work, etc. Let's say some people, for example, just organising this debate, just turn them on. Other people spend hours trying to get that Facebook interest rate up. And I think that's when you have things democratically run by the working class, run by ordinary people, us all deciding, putting our input in, I think people actually do take effect of that. It is fair to say the majority will vote that especially if you agree with, let's say, the arguments of human nature, the majority of people will think that actually the person who works the hardest should get less. If you work 3 hours long doing the same job as someone who only works an hour, surely you should get 3 times as much. But the problem is that in socialism, we could make those decisions, we could have those arguments, we could have those debates, we could bring in all sorts of things. You could bring in the difficulty of work, bring in all sorts of aspects. Do we really want to run society like that? Under capitalism, it is at the discretion and the want of the bourgeoisie, of one person running a factory, running a corporation, running all of these things. And effectively, we see that in the entire economy as a whole. I mean, again, you make all the... and again, I just want to point out... Actually, no, I'll point out later. Did I miss anyone's points? Please do say if I did. One of the other things, again, your final point on the whole idea that, in capitalism, the market will magically distribute and produce whatever we need. Yeah, that's a complete fallacy. We produce enough food in the earth for 11 billion people. 1 billion people starve. Many of them in cities like Coventry, throughout the UK, where people are forced to use food banks. Many of them in, terrible situations. There are hundreds of, thousands of homeless people in London, and yet even more empty rooms, just lying there, because, some rich oligarch likes to go to central London on holiday 3 times a year, whilst people sleep homeless. I mean, you could argue, well, surely they should just try harder. But I think there becomes a point, where there's effectively limited resources under capitalism, and, there's limited people getting it, because huge chunks of that pie of global growth are being taken by a very small class. Just the final statistics, and then I think we can go back to the floor. It's something now like 69 people own the same wealth as the poorest 500 people combined. Poorest half of the population, not 500 people combined. Poorest 50% combined. This is the types of failures in production, failures in distribution, which we see in the capitalism. And sadly, it's only going to get worse as we head into a new period of complete stagnation and destruction on behalf of the capitalist system. Thank you very much. Percentage points.
I was just going to weigh in on the point that you gave, question you gave earlier about how do you define socialism. On our side, we just see it as, to what extent do you believe a market works as a central means of distributing resources? On our side, we think that there is no tool currently known to man that distributes resources as efficiently and as with little effort as markets do. And therefore, we should rely on a market for essentially being able to distribute resources. And of course, the socialism is the other side, and if you don't believe that, then what? Yeah, that's all I have.
Probably shouldn't mind itching to make a point. I probably should. We'll go to the floor. Have we got any questions?
I have a point.
A point?
Yeah.
On your exit?
No, actually, it's exit.
We'll let you sit down. We'll go to this gentleman over here. No. Sorry, do you have your arm raised as well? Me? No, in the middle row.
I have a question as well.
The lady, you have a point as well? Yeah, you have one.
How would you define equality? Equality in what sense do you mean? Because there are different types of equality.
And us to both speakers.
No, to the social society.
Okay. And you, sir?
I have a question for the Marxists. You keep on talking about the state calling the shots and making decisions, but what if the state is wrong? Why do you assume that necessarily the state is right when calling the shots?
And you, sir, as I did say, you have your point.
Can I just ask, what's wrong with social democracy, a mixed economy? Because you keep kind of talking about quality, food banks, those kinds of problems. But surely, in that kind of system, you can solve that with a significant amount of legislation without having to go all the way into full socialism and Marxism. Surely you can have a balance of both and achieve that quality, which I think everybody desires, without having to take what I would see as quite an extreme position. And equally, the social capitalism, surely it doesn't all have to be about, kind of 19th century Gilded Age America, big bosses like Rockefellers oppressing the working class.
Okay, brilliant question. Maybe just to even up the responses, anyone who has a particular question for, without any derogatory connotations, capitalist? Any questions? Tim, do you have a question?
Not a question, but a contribution. So this could probably be a bit longer. If you want to take any questions, before I actually say something. I don't know.
Preferably, yeah. We'll take some questions here from the floor. We'll come back to you. Any questions for, again, no derogatory connotations, capitalist? Yes, sir.
So far, we focus mainly on kind of these like authoritarian, socialistic systems. So, what would you say to, for example, like anarchist socialist systems? For example, anarchist Catalonia during the Civil War and the Free State of Ukraine.
Top question there. Any others for? Yes, from.
Yes, I'm obviously part of the Marxist Society as well. But yes, this is just expanding upon the point you made earlier about Pinochet, right, and the various sort of dictatorial regimes that were allied with America. So I think you seemed a bit confused why he was bringing them up. It seemed like they were, as it were, irrelevant or accidentally related to America. Just as a consideration, not as an argument, do you think it's possible that it's a necessary function of American capitalism, or else capitalism in general, that it exerts this form of imperialism and relies upon powers abroad engaging in exploitative and dictatorial regimes to increase its wealth back at home? Just as a consideration.
Just in case anyone at the back didn't hear that question, that was a question put to you.
American capitalism, imperialism,
Yeah.
is it possible?
I was thinking...
Is there a necessary connection between capitalism and that kind of imperialism?
Okay. And is this for the... Okay, we'll come back to the floor for now, and then we'll come back to the questions. So, Thomas, you have a few to answer. Would you like to make a start?
Okay, let's go for... Oh, there's quite a few. Okay, so just on equality as a definition. Well, I mean, it is one of the things put forward by, liberal philosophers, that we need freedom in this sense. I'm all for equality of opportunity, and that basically we shouldn't have a society where just because you're born, incredibly rich, you will now live a lovely life despite however hard I work and try. I'm not like you all have to be the same, wear the same clothes and stuff like that. Just in a very, general, liberal sense of, it's not particularly too much. I'm not arguing everyone has to be exactly the same, but currently the disparities in inequality that we currently see in our current society are so huge and massive, I think that it's very difficult to look over them. On the whole idea of the state making decisions, I see where you're coming from, but when I say democratic ownership, I'm not necessarily implying a state. I don't mean that, let's say, a world government has to all meet up in a room and suddenly decide that everyone from, let's say, John selling ice cream down on the beach to our Mars program and plan every meticulous detail. I'm simply saying that those in making those decisions, the people whose decision they affect, they should be the one making it. So, for example, and Marx, Lenin, they all talk very much about devolution and what we can currently call devolution, in the fact that actually, that ideas should only be centralised as much as they need to be. So, for example, again, with the whole concept of, let's say, if you imagine a local ice cream seller, they probably don't need that much interaction with a global or national or even local government. They could probably simply all decide, whoever's selling the ice cream, democratically what to do there, to how much ice cream to produce, how many cones, and things like that. This does not need to be decided at a global level. If, for example, however you take, let's say, national health care, or let's say climate change, or the, or again, space stations, etc., these are probably more centralised decisions. I don't think the state as just, this big national organ is particularly, is something we're talking about here. It's about, people who are affected taking those democratic decisions. I hope that makes sense there. And finally, I think one of the really, really interesting questions by my friend over there on the whole idea of social democracy. I mean, that does seem to have a little bit, let's say people always look back, Britain in the 1960s, wasn't that great? Or, and point to all these very much high points of capitalism, and it does kind of seem, like, there we go, there's capitalism without the evilness, but without the conflict or, needed against socialism or anything like that. Yeah, the problem I have with this isn't a steady state for capitalism. This isn't social democracy isn't something which capitalism can constantly do. I think the best evidence of this is our current economic crisis and climate we currently see ourselves in. I do not suspect for 1 minute that the Tory government in 2010 came to power on the basis, we're going to really wind up doctors, because, we're ideologically, we just hate doctors, our key group of voters, and we're going to make them into the most militant trade unions in Britain. That wasn't their idea. Yet the forces of capitalism, the need to continue for companies to continue producing profits, to constantly be part of the global economy, all orientated towards profits, has led to a state where currently the Tory government is attacking one of their key voting groups in the form of doctors. Similarly, I don't think Hollande came to power on the basis of 90% tax. Actually, the way he got there decided, no, it'd be a much better idea to go and attack all of my key voters who got me here, as he destroys and battles trade unions in France. This wasn't because he came up with some weird ideas, but this is what the coercive will of capitalism, the need to continue to make profit, the need to have society oriented to exchange rather than use, creates. And this is what Marx talks about in these contradictions of capitalism, that these really aren't escapable. So whilst I'd love it if we could all have massive welfare states and everyone could be nice and it could all just be lovely and all of that as we all use a market economy, unfortunately, if you are having a market economy, as you're producing for exchange, as I would describe it as on a global scale, as your primary thing, you are going to hit situations where capitalism will go into crisis, will attack the working class, and will create these conflicts. They arise organically and not somehow thrown in from within. So to that, I'd say social democracy is utopian, which probably sounds a bit weird for most people, but it isn't achievable in that sense.
And to your question on anarchism.
Yeah, I'll get to the two questions I've got written down. So real quick, we just heard about a stateless society where all come together and negotiate with all the others. Pardon me, it sounds a bit utopian to me. I can't throw out the same levels of examples that maybe the what I do know is that I cannot believe that if you distribute, or even in a thought experiment, you distribute property evenly throughout every single person and have them all work together and say, I am going to invest and therefore benefit from my investment, that 20 years down the line, what you'll have is an exactly equal group, that everyone's speaking with each other at the same level. Because the incentive is I'm going to invest so therefore I can get more, and therefore I can get an advantage over my people around me, because that way I can have a slightly better standard of living. And that is his profit incentive. And even if we imagine a state of nature where everything is equal, and we start off with a basics of contract where everything is equal, we have heard no mechanism whereby that continues, whereby we guarantee equality. Anyways, my focus on authoritarian socialist has been mainly because, just as we heard just now about how certain capitalist people don't go in and say, I'm going to alienate all my voters. Socialist ideologues don't necessarily come to power from someone that's slightly whacked out his mouth. Probably doesn't come to power and say, I want to kill 20 to 30 million of my peasants, right?
Mao could be an exception there, but I get your point.
He could be an exception, I'll take your point. Lenin doesn't come and say, I'm going to use poison gas and drown my own workers and use poison gas against my own peasants. He doesn't come to it. But the pressures of socialism, of imposing upon people an idea of we all need to work together and that you need to think not for yourself, when really most of the working poor have to think for themselves, but for a sort of wider collective. It's so hard to defend that maybe in certain situations, I don't know, Belgium didn't have a government for a little while, it might be possible. But certainly when it's helping the poor and the impoverished and the people in extreme poverty, the pressures force ideologues who I want to believe in the area who I have some admiration for, did not want to impose the Ujamaa and force mass relocation upon his own people in Tanzania. But because people don't want to buy his agenda, he's forced with either I'm going to have to give up on my ideas or I'm going to have to push my ideology through by force. And the latter tends to go. So that's why authoritarian regimes are so common in socialism. It's so fixed, it's so rigid. And people rebel against that because it goes against the incentive of just, if I've worked really hard on my essay, I want a decent grade, sort of thing. I want just reward for my work. American capitalist imperialism. Can I countenance it? Well, capital mobility is particularly high with the FDI in foreign developing countries. The rate of economic growth in developing countries in the last decade has been 2% higher than in the previous 4 decades. Certainly, American intervention in foreign countries has been very unpleasant, especially in South America, but I'd like to posit that maybe that's not economic in nature. Perhaps it's political in nature. Perhaps it's great power rivalry. Perhaps it's social in nature. The World Bank, in terms of we've been hearing a lot about inequality, the World Bank recently, published a report on global inequality, and it noted that of the 3 main kinds of inequality, global inequality, inside border inequality, and between border inequality, 2 of those in the last 2 decades have been going down. Countries in the 1950s, the disparity between rich countries and poor countries was much bigger than it is now. And that's funny, that, isn't it? Like, we hear all this about how we are being exploited by a group, but actually the distance between us and the various poorest in the world aren't that far apart. So, I'm probably be happy to say, if you want to frame it as American capitalist expansionism or imperialism, good, bring it on. It's getting more people rich.
Okay, I did promise Tim that he'd be able to make his contribution, so we'll go to Tim and we'll come back to the floor for questions.
Yeah, I think on that sort of last point there, the speaker spoke about, I think that that's a pretty poor analysis, that there isn't such a distance between us here in the imperialist metropolis and the people in the third world and poor countries. I mean, poverty there is absolute poverty. The impoverishment of the masses of working people here in the metropolis are relative to the poorest. Now, there is a massive, and this is already being shown, there is a massive disparity, income disparity, between the richest in society that only constitutes a handful. I can't quantify it in numeric, in terms, but it is a massive disparity. I think the speaker there, defence capitalism, has demonstrated to me that he actually understands the tyranny and despotism of modern finance capitalism much more so than he actually understands Marxism or socialism. I am a Marxist-Leninist. I've done my homework, and I can say categorically that the Soviet Union, the first successful worker state, built itself up into an economy that was the envy of the world. It had built itself up massively in industrialisation and collectivisation. And this is at a time where the imperialist world was going through perhaps the most acute crisis of overproduction. And the Soviet Union was going from strength to strength with one successful 5-year plan after another. On the question of the surplus requisition of grain, well, war communism actually made that a necessity, because grain had to go to the front to feed the Red Army. So there was a necessity for that surplus requisition. That period came to an end, and then we moved towards the new economic policy. The new economic policy was a temporary retreat back, but it was only partial, and the state had strict control on all the key aspects of the economy.
If you could wrap this up.
Yeah. So I mean, these were only temporary phases. The notion that the market can take care of everything is about as ridiculous as the idea that there's some filter down, some trickle down of wealth. If you produce this wealth at the top, it filters down, to the working class. That is simply not the case. Until we have a planned economy that deletes the anarchy of the market. We have a centralised planned economy where workers own the means of production. Until we get that, we're going to be none the further in sorting out the difficulties.
There's quite a lot there.
I'm going to give Jonathan a chance to respond to that, because there was quite a lot there, and we'll come to the floor for questions.
Yeah, I'll try to go through this as quickly as possible. I've got two main points from what you said. One, a characterisation of what inequality looks like today, which is horrid, really horrid. I've been to Rio, I've walked through a favela. It is not pleasant. It is not nice seeing people live in subsistence conditions without a proper roof over their head, sheet metal doesn't count. It's not pleasant. I also heard a defence of the USSR and a defence of the 5-year planned economy, which is... Honestly, I didn't compile statistics because I was told that the Marxist Society weren't in the position to defend Stalin, so I didn't.
Yes, we wouldn't be to
I'll go through the inequality point. Yes, inequality is horrid. It is not new. It's been around for years, centuries, millennia. When I say that the gap between the richest and the poorest is shrinking, or the richest and the poorest countries is shrinking, and in terms of global inequality, we take people in terms of outside of the context of the borders in which they find themselves, the distance between them is shrinking, and and that the general Gini index, which is what the World Bank uses to measure inequality, is changing. All those have been reduced in the last 30 years. And this is a World Bank report. I can send it to you if you want. So, yeah. Is it solved? No. But note China. About a third, maybe even half, of the numbers of people that we pulled out of poverty in the last 30 years happened in China alone. Over 500 million people. When China opened its doors to the world economy, allowed the development of private enterprise, decentralized its own state economy, and returned capital to the people so they could pursue their own interests, there is a large incentive both to produce, and people did produce, but there's also a big move and a great development. And the reason that China has been able to mobilize itself in the past few years is because the basic tenets of harnessing humans' desire to self-better their situation and exchange with others, which are the two basic tenets of capitalism, profit and exchange, that China has been able to pull 570 million people in 30 years out of extreme poverty. Defense of the Soviet Union, I feel like this is so polarized, and people know quite a lot about it. I don't want to go into great detail. First 5-year plan, though, I wouldn't air that view in Ukraine, where the collectivization of agriculture, which was one of the subset policies of the first 5-year plan, initiated a mass famine, which killed 3 million people. A man-made famine that the consensus amongst people today, and certainly in Ukrainian politics, is one of genocide. So maybe it's based on who you are. Certainly by 1940, the USSR was producing lots, but at what cost? And our moral position is that if it involves the death of 3 million people in a man-made genocide, social engineering, where you round up large numbers of certain groups of peasantry and deport them and move them and force them into labor and restrict mobility and restrict basic freedoms, that is not a price we're willing to pay for development, especially when markets in the US, which we acknowledge as a global hegemony today, has achieved it in a way that is still costly, but not to the same degree.
Go to the fourth questions.
Contribution as well.
I did promise you a contribution. We'll take a few questions first.
Yeah.
Contribution. For you, sir, you want to make one now? Yes.
Yes, to the Marxists actually. You seem really to be comparing democratic socialism in theory with capitalism in practice, to my mind. But my real question for you is that you use what is in effect euphemism of democracy, but why is it moral to use the guys with guns to go around to other people's houses and shops, point a gun at their head and say your money or your life, which is pretty much socialism in practice in terms of the forced takeover of private people's money and property? I mean, what's your fair share of what someone else has worked for, what someone else has laboured for? Case in point, when the NHS was nationalised in 1948, the biggest backlash was actually from the doctors who owned private practices, because the state was utilising force to take over their lands. Now, the power which my boss has over me is only to sack me. The power which even the lowest government official in the social state has over me is a power to regulate and control every single aspect of my life.
Other questions? Yes. Yes.
I'm actually from Russia, and you probably want to talk about good things that happened during socialism. I know you don't have to defend Stalin. So Gorbachev was fairly socialist. He was also fairly democratic. He enlisted freedom of speech, freedom of press. The only problem was that people got a lot of money. They just couldn't buy anything. And my grandma worked her whole life and got a lot of money to buy, I don't know, a car or a coat. It just nobody was selling the coats because nobody was producing them. Everyone had money. Money was useless because nothing could be bought with it. And if you want to avoid that, you need to enforce measures of total control, such as Stalinism, and then you have to defend it. And a national hero is a kid who made his own father go to prison because his father wasn't agreeing with the regime that was happening. I can see how this is
to the socialist side, I would like to ask, because you said that it's all about democratic processes and democratic control of labor. In a socialist system, when we have government taking care of distribution of labor, the incentive for individuals to abuse this power is much bigger than in capitalism. Because in capitalism, there is mutual system of governments and markets that stand against each other and as such try to balance their negative influence on the people. What we see from countries such as Russia or Poland, where I was born and raised, is that those individuals that come to power inside the governments abuse people even more than people in corporations, because corporations are already restricted by governments and negate any democratic processes whatsoever. And therefore the abundance of empirical evidence suggests that socialism cannot work in practice.
Thank you very much. Another question. Yes, you said down the middle.
I really like your example of the blankets in winter. The blankets in winter with the coats. So the thing is, yeah, I also agree that capitalism it's a good incentive for all these people to have money, more money. So you work more and you earn more, well, get more money. So it's a powerful incentive. Now, suppose in this scenario, so you are providing codes. So if somebody is not regulating it, okay, it's kind of like a frequent scenario. So what if you kind of start to raise the prices? So the poor people who don't have that kind of money to buy the increased price, I mean buy goods with the increased price. So they will basically freeze to death, starve. And that's what happens. And also this is why there's so much inequality. In the US I was reading a statistic where there are more number of empty houses than the number of homeless people. And also we all know that there's a lot more than 96% of the wealth is in the hand of top 1% of the people. So there is a huge inequality. So where does capitalism stand on these kind of things? So basically, a lot of people actually argue on so there's market competition on these things. This don't really work that much because suppose, for example, the frame you're wearing right now, the glasses, the tablets. These are made by various other companies like Oakley, Ray-Ban, and all these kind of things. There's one Italian company called Glass30 that actually controls all these things. So there's a huge monopoly. So every frame you actually buy, even everything, the glasses and all the whole package controls, one company controls all these things. And fairly large company like Oakley kind of tried to, try to counter this kind of things, but lots of it is so big they kind of gobbled them up. So, yeah, that's my point. Where does capitalism?
Okay, just to sum up that question for anyone who fell out of it halfway through, does capitalism have a tendency to centralise, and therefore does this lead to monopoly and no competition, so all the benefits of the market you would see are completely gone? That's the question. And we'll go back to the we'll go back to the speakers. Thomas, you have a few to answer.
Yeah, quite a few. I'm going to try and go through, get the general gist of what was being asked. Many questions are focused on, see, all the people who were going to stand at, knew they were going to leave early, sitting at the corners. But many questions have been focused on this idea that, for example, is it really any more just, let's say, to have the state taking over your property than, just capitalists doing it? And when the state does it, as we've seen in examples of Stalinist Russia and Mao's China, it can be far, far worse. But what I'd say to my friend there, is that in a socialist society, you are the lowest state official in that sense. You are the person making these decisions, having these debates, trying to work out how the economy should run in, let's say, your local business, going to your political meetings to work out how it should run in your local town, the nation, the world, etc. No, of course, you don't have to go to all those meetings, you know. Only a few political nerds, I'll raise my hand there, probably would. But this is type of control, because it is at the control of society that we can have this. And whilst we can still have this society control, as we've seen to extent in the USSR, in the failures of the 20th century, what we see is that without this democracy, without this ability for any individual to really try and make their arguments, make their case, convince people, we see that fundamentally it fails, fundamentally it suffocates. And again, just to go back to my analogy, socialism needs democracy like a human body needs air. And I think this is what we see in many examples, suffocated. But to kind of then go back onto actually, well, this all sounds pretty nice, but, you know, how do we actually achieve that? How do we create a system where, you know, all of production is socialised? It is in a situation where it's not just anarchic people doing their own thing, but has some kind of direction by society. And actually, capitalism has achieved that for us. As my friend over there was talking about, you know, the centralisation of what we see around the globe already creates the structures needed for socialist takeover. I read somewhere there's this one finance firm called BlackRock. I may have the statistics slightly wrong, so if someone does have them, please correct me. But it's around, it owns about 10% of it owns like about the top 100 companies. It owns like about 40 of them, it owns over 50%. There's some ridiculous numbers like that. And you see that actually because the power is all in these systems. All we say as socialists is let's socialise that, let's give that to the people, let's reorientate power that way. So rather than the diktats of bosses, you have the democratic decisions of workers to make these decisions. And these would require actually very little in the way of reforms. They'd be major reforms, but very little in that sense. All you'd have to do is effectively, you know, just basically give workers control of those companies. Make sure that rather than control sitting at the hands of capital and power, there you have it in, you know, just ordinary people. You make these structures democratic. Yes, you may have to do that using big organisations like the state, etc. But, you know, fundamentally that's what capitalists do every day to enforce their power. When trade unions go out to try and achieve these, when Soviets go out and to, you know, creating as workers' councils to try and achieve these aims, it is time and time again the state which comes in and crushes and literally murders, literally massacres people who try this. We've even seen that in Britain in the 1945 government. Just on the one bit issue, I think actually my friend did make a very good point on the whole idea that, well, you know, actually we have seen enormous growth from, let's say, you know, China. Billions of people were lifted up, or hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty, you know. Is the world growing? And I'd say, you know, yes, in some extent we have seen that. We have seen, you know, living standards improve. You know, Britain 250 years ago used to be basically huts with, like, rich kings running around with fancy hats, etc. We now have an objectively better society. But the problem is this does... You say this trend will continue. But I'm going to tell you what the IMF and the OECD and all the capitalist economists, these are not Marxist people by any stretch of your imagination, are saying, no, it won't. Capitalism has reached a point on a global scale where its contradictions, its crisis just cannot achieve the same monumental growth. Again, you know, China's growth was from effectively a feudal Stalinist backwater, all very weird, to you know, the current place where it is, where there has been this increase in March, was fueled on 10% growth a year. China, the current prediction for China this year is 3%. It is actually, in a couple of years, it is not unreasonable to think China could actually be in a recession. The same goes for Brazil, Russia, to let's say India. The European Union is currently collapsing. America was predicted to be in recession in 2019 before Trump was elected. I'm not sure it's going to look too much better under Trump. And these are the situations we currently see, is that capitalism has done good in the past, we'll all admit that, but now it is just a hindrance to society. It has created the ways in which we can transfer to a socialist society where we can easily have people making decisions in their own workplace, in their own local communities, yet because of the interest of a small few who are incredibly powerful and rich, it fails not to. I say we should change that power, we should create a society for the betterment of everyone. Very much.
heard the doomsday of capitalism before. We heard it in the 1930s, and we've heard it in the 1970s. Now we hear it again. I think your question, sir, was really good, because I think it hit the nail on the head of the problem. And I thought when you were bringing it up, the example you used was EpiPen. EpiPen, or just the pharmaceutical industry generally, which is this sort of semi-corrupt, static, oligopolistic mess, which has prices that are too high, and that poor people suffer because they cannot get access to medication they need, especially if they're come down with diseases which are quite uncommon. So we have a problem then of high prices. And then the question is, what is to be done? But do we then throw a tantrum and say, no more markets, no more markets, it's done so good for us so far, but no more markets. We're going to revert to an ideology which is 20, 30 years past its sell-by date in the collapse of international socialism at the start of the 1990s. Or do we think, how can we reform the market? Because liberal economics is still a developing field, and there are ideas on how to improve capitalism. Competition, how do we foster competition? Can we lower barriers of entry in a certain way, either through technology or through government intervention as a neutral arbiter? And therefore, can we create this competition, force people who, of course, naturally are incentivized to hoard? If we jump in the middle and try to break them up a little bit, will they then compete with each other? But at the end of the day, we recognize that the market, in being based in such a way whereby it is the people who are making the decisions of how things are distributed are fundamentally the suppliers and the consumers. And of course, sometimes the suppliers have much more say than the consumers, and as a result, you have these imbalances. If we should preserve that, because this is the most direct way of distributing resources and the most efficient way, because the needs and wants and desires of people transmit straight into economic activity, rather than transferring responsibility for these processes to some separate body which doesn't really have the same involvement, cannot empathize in the same way. So, is capitalism, is the status quo perfect? No. Does that mean capitalism is dead? No. Does that mean we need socialism? No.
Just for considerations of time, Jonathan would like to get home and have his dinner. So this is going to be the last set of questions for anyone who'd like to raise any points. Oh, Jesus. Right, let's start with you guys and we'll work our way across.
Okay. Let's bring it back to capitalism and imperialism.
Oh, and if you can make your points brief, all the better.
I will try and make it really brief. I'll just draw on one example. I could do about 12 off the top of my head, but I'm a history nerd, whatever. You said maybe it was political. I would argue that the political threat posed by Guatemala and its democratically elected government was not really why America engineered the coup there. It was actually the fact that the United Fruit Company, that was one of America's biggest earners, owned 70% of land, and that the American Secretary of State, John F. Dulles, actually was the legal representative of them in a court case where they tried to fight nationalisation. Point is, one of his aides even said that democracy, and he's referring to South America, he said democracy there isn't profitable. That was his reference for it. The point is, I'd argue that capitalism is, it's all well and good in touting democracy, but does it go out and promote democracy? No, it goes out and promotes what is most profitable for itself. And America historically has always done that. And you could argue it's a political threat. I just don't think Guatemala, Chile, or Grenada pose a threat to America.
To you, sir.
Thank you. My question is basically, we keep talking about this concept of work being paid what it's worth. And my question is this, do junior doctors, nurses, teachers, cleaners, do they not work harder or even more hard, I would argue, than people like Philip Green or these banks who are being paid millions and millions of pounds of bonuses, yet crashed the economy in 2008? And the question is, whose work are people being paid for? Is it their own? Or is it the case of Philip Green, where he's going around stealing from pension pots to buy himself luxury yachts?
The next question. Right, I've been promising you a contribution for a little while now.
I'll put it down from what I have written.
Thank you.
Alright, in terms of what's been said, I'm not going to pretend I've agreed with everything that either speaker has said, but I think it's fairly obvious which side I'm going to come down on. When you spoke, so you said that talk about mass nationalisation as if in itself it's a bad thing. But nationalisation of, for example, the banks before the financial crash, would that not have been a positive step in preventing the gambling and the speculation that was part of the cause of that crash? And you mentioned about socialism being coercion. Because of course, under capitalism, no one's ever been coerced into a job that they didn't want to do. No one has ever been coerced into any kind of field of labour that was not right for them. And we can talk about the nasty acts of dictators all day. I'll be as good as I can with this, but Batista, the US-backed dictator in Cuba, killed thousands of people. Pinochet, US-backed dictator, thrown the Thatcher, killed thousands of people, detained 80,000 people without trial. That's dictatorship. That's capitalist dictatorship. I'll skip a couple of points there. The countries that you referred to, also not socialist, we can again categorise them in various different ways, but the nationalisation that took place there was not about democratising the economy, it was about primarily increasing control as a way of resisting imperialist expansion in former colonial countries. I will sum up with two quick points. Socialism is the democratic ownership of the means of production, as you said. It's a democratically planned economy. And we can talk about the failure of various self-styled socialist countries. If you want to see the failure of capitalism, I'm from Coventry, if you can't tell from the accent. Now, Coventry used to be the richest working class city in the country. To walk out of a job in the morning, walk into another in the afternoon. We were a city that was proud of our car factories. Now it's a city that's got one car factory and 15 food banks. That's the failure of capitalism. If you, I'm part of the socialist students. If you want to talk to us afterwards, we've got a store outside. That'll be great. Cheers.
Yes, sorry, that's you.
So, like, you say democracy works or whatever, but, like, democracy did produce, like, Donald Trump, fraudulent Brexit and whatever. It leads to populism. So, do you think government decisions would be made better by, kind of meritocracy and technocracy, where people that are more qualified make or have a greater proportion of the decision making, so that you can essentially get more efficient politics and economics done?
I'll take that as an open question to both speakers. So if you apply to both.
Well, yeah, we can actually, yeah.
And the next question, Asma, you've been waiting at the back there.
The capitalist side of, I have a question for him. He said that American intervention in South America was primarily not political, it might have been social or economic or cultural, whatever.
He said it wasn't economic, it may have been political or social.
Yeah, he said it might have been that, but I don't see any difference between economic and political intervention, because wherever America has intervened, it's basically for money, for oil, for capturing the resources of the country. Take the example of Libya. It was a wonderful country, free education, everybody was happy, and then one day America, the American president wakes up and he intervenes in the country and kills the dictator. According to them, Gaddafi was a dictator, but he was not. And then similarly, you take the example of Hugo Chavez in Latin America, Venezuela. In 1998, when he came to power, Venezuela was under a huge debt. But after 10 years of his regime, Venezuela actually put off all the debt, and the elections which took place in 2008, the voter turnout was 93%, which is more than America. Similarly, he cited the World Bank reports. I study development as a subject, and I know where does most of the funding of the World Bank, come from. So you have to first question the authenticity of these reports. We know that the World Bank and UN and all these organizations are primarily funded by America and its cohorts like France, like UK, and other, capitalist countries. So you can't really say. According to them, poverty might be shrinking, but it actually is not. The reports in Paris, in London, in New York look one way, but when you go to Africa, to Asia, and other, countries, the ground reality is completely different. So I don't quite agree with what he said.
Okay. Any final? We have one here, and that will be. You have a response?
A follow-up question.
Okay, if you can make it quick, that'd be brilliant.
Yeah, sure. proposes is one more utopia where capitalists and the people with money doesn't influence government, and the government actually takes they don't lead our politics, and they don't actually abuse their power and all. So that's one more utopia. So basically, what you're talking about is not authoritarianism. So if you can, distinguish socialism with the authoritarianism viewpoint, why socialism is not a solution against capitalism? Why? If you just take out the authoritarianism.
Also, we're getting low and back from the live stream.
Okay, quickly. Yeah, it'll be quick. Basically, you talk about Belgium. The fact they didn't have a government for over a year, maybe 2 years. Homeless rates shot out the roof in that time, and that's something we all forget. And that's due to their reliance upon government. So my question to you is, under capitalist system, in capitalism, how much influence must government have in terms of, say, environmental issues or security? Even healthcare and education, how much influence does government have? Okay, I'm going to take that for all the questions for now. Apologies to Jonathan, it seems like all the questions for him have come right at the end. So we'll go to the closing remarks from the speakers. Jonathan, you have a long list. I'll let you get started, I think, if you're ready. Or we could go to Thomas for you.
Basically, I'm going to sum up the debate, and if your question was unanswered, I'll apologise and you can badger me after the debate. I think that's fair enough.
That is fair enough.
Okay. What we heard today in this debate was that the status quo is not great, and that rhymes. And it's true, we face problems, and yet they posit socialism as a solution. Socialism that provides no meaningful way or incentive for people to produce because they do not know whether they can benefit from it. They propose some form of removing property and assets and just general capital from the ownership and the control of a bourgeoisie. But who does it go to? The general perception in history is it goes to a small state group who then just use it for their own ends. And that's what history has told us. We get a position that democracy, we have some kind of democratic solution. But we do not understand why we should believe that's the case, or why that could possibly come to be. How does that preserve equality? How does that promote growth? None of these questions are answered. They're just said that this is a solution. The US currently has projected 3% growth, unemployment underneath 5%, inflation is negligible. In terms of macroeconomic checklist, that's pretty much every box ticked. So, and yet, there's lots of unhappy people, and it's sad. I recognize that. What does the market give us? Any form of market. It gives us a mechanism whereby resources are distributed according to needs and desires, and it is not always distributed perfectly. But essentially, there is a means of communication whereby someone who desires X can communicate to someone who is in a position to supply X and have that transaction proceed. That is what a market is. It's not very difficult. And what capitalism is, fundamentally, is just support of the market as a distributive mechanism. And it has functioned so far to the point where I've managed to get the Marxists to concede that, which I'm quite proud of, I'm not going to lie. So, as a result, I beg you, it's probably not very likely, but I'd hope that you would vote for the capitalists.
Just as a final concession, that was what Marx said in the Communist Manifesto. But we have reached a point where such great gains of capitalism have ended. He only spoke, oh, but have they not said this in the 1930s? Did they not say it in the 1980s? And now they say it again in 2016. Well, I do not believe we were wrong in the 1930s, because what it required for capitalism to regain its spirit of growth was for 16 million people to die in World War II, was for the whole structure to change, and was for US imperialism to dominate with having 50% of the world economy. I mean, if we're all for restarting economic growth with a nuclear war, then I'm not particularly sure that capitalism has too much moral support left in that case. You know, I mean, the 1980s, another peculiar case where you actually saw the collapse of the Stalinist regimes, falling under their own contradictions of effectively, you know, not having that democracy there, expansion of markets. That saved it. It saved it for 26 years. And now in 2016, from the crisis of 2008, even the most bourgeois economists are hanging their heads in shame at a pitiful display of an economic system which promised so much, which no longer had the hindrance of massive trade unions, which no longer had the hindrance of USSR or China, which had the entire world's political economic powers to play with, and has established is diminishing returns year on year. You mentioned again the projections from the US, yet these have been consistently revised downwards, I believe 3 or 4 consecutive times in a row, and it continues to do so at this point. The fact of the matter is capitalism has run its course. Capitalism is unable to provide for the mass of ordinary people who need a socialist alternative today, as soon as possible. If you agree with these ideas, I implore you to join us at the Warwick Marxist Society as part of the international Marxist tendency in fighting against a system which is truly at the end of its ropes. Thank you very much, and I hope, again, if any of you want to really quickly change your vote, please feel free to do.
Go on.
Thank you very much.
Turn off the live stream? Yeah.
Yeah, you can set it